Mrs Pepperpot and the Puppet Show. It was a lovely summer's day, just the day for an outing. The village sewing club had been invited to a television show in the nearest town, and they were going by special coach. Mrs Pepperpot was going too, and very excited she was, as she'd never watched a TV show in a theatre before. Nor had any of the others for that matter, and they had all put on their best summer frocks and straw hats with flowers. On the way they prattled, as women do, and wondered what it would be like. They were going to see a puppet show, and Sarah South was sure that everyone else in the village would be envying them. When they got to the town, the bus stopped in the market square, and they all got off. As they walked into the hall, Nora North said, "One thing we shouldn't do. Smile at the camera. It looks so silly when you're watching TV. Especially if you have gaps in your teeth," said Mrs East, who could be a bit sharp when she liked. They felt rather shy when they were given the front row of seats, but soon they were all comfortably seated with little bags of peppermints to munch. All except Mrs Pepperpot. Where was she? Well, you know how she likes to poke her nose into things. And as they were walking along the passage to their seats, Mrs Pepperpot heard someone sniffling and crying in a little room next to the stage. "That's funny," she thought, and peeped through the door. There she saw a full-grown man with a top hat and long mustachios sitting on a chair, crying like a baby. "Well, I never," said Mrs Pepperpot. But before she had time to follow the rest of her party, she shrank. As she stood there, a tiny figure by the door in her bright summer dress and little straw hat, the puppet man saw her at once. Quick as a knife, he stretched out his hand and picked her up. "There you are," he said, holding her tightly between finger and thumb. "I thought I'd lost you." Mrs Pepperpot was so terrified she didn't move. But when the man had a closer look, he said, "But you're not my Sleeping Beauty puppet at all." "Course I'm not," said Mrs Pepperpot. "The very idea." "All the same," said the puppet man, "as I can't find my most important puppet, you'll have to play her part. You'll look fine with a blonde wig and a crown and a veil, and I'll make your face up so that you'll be really beautiful." "You let me go this minute," shouted Mrs Pepperpot, struggling to get out of the man's grip. "Who ever heard of an old woman like me playing Sleeping Beauty? Now, you have talent. You can act, I'm sure of it. And that's more than can be said of my other puppets, who have to be handled with sticks and threads. You can walk and talk by yourself. You're just what I've always dreamed of, and you'll bring me success and lots of money. You'll see." "Over my dead body," said Mrs Pepperpot, who was still furious. "I don't even remember the story of Sleeping Beauty." "I shall be telling the story," explained the puppet man, "and you just have to do the things I say. But you don't come into the first act at all, so you can stand at the side and watch the other puppets through the crack in the curtain. Now, it's time for the show to start, so be a sport and stay there, won't you?" "I may, and I mayn't," said Mrs Pepperpot. So he lifted her gingerly down on the side of the puppet stage, which was set up in the middle of the real theatre stage. Then the lights in the hall went out, and those on the little stage went on. Mrs Pepperpot peeped through the hole in the curtain. The scene was a magnificent marble hall, and she could see a puppet king and queen sitting on their thrones with their courtiers standing around. They were looking at a baby doll in a cradle. The man began to speak behind the stage. There was once a king and a queen who had been blessed with a baby princess. Lucky he didn't want me to lie in the cradle, thought Mrs. Pepperpot. The man read on, telling how the good fairies were asked to the christening party and how they each gave the little princess a gift. Waving their wands over her cradle, the fairies came in one by one. May you have the gift of beauty, said one. May you have the gift of patience, said another. I could certainly do with that gift, said Mrs. Pepperpot to herself. If there's anything I lack, it's patience. When all the good fairies except one had waved their wands over the cradle, there was a terrible clap of thunder, and the stage went completely dark for a moment. Goodness gracious, cried Mrs. Pepperpot. I hope they haven't had a breakdown. She was beginning to get excited about the play now. The lights came on again, and there was the bad fairy leaning over the baby with her wand. Ha ha! said the puppet man in an old witch sort of voice. Today you are all happy, but this is my gift to the princess. In your 15th year may you prick your finger on a spindle and die. And with that, the bad fairy vanished in another clap of thunder and blackout. Well, if I'm the Sleeping Beauty, I'm a good deal more than 15 years old, and I'm still hale and hearty, thought Mrs. Pepperpot. The puppet man had now brought on another fairy to tell the king and queen that their daughter would not really die, but only go into a long, long sleep. One day a prince will come and wake her up, said the fairy, and that was the end of the first act. The puppet man was glad to see Mrs. Pepperpot still standing there, but he didn't take any chances and caught her up roughly before she could protest. No matter how much she wriggled, she was dressed in the princess's blonde wig, with a crown on top and a veil down her back. The worst part was when the puppet man made up her face. Ugh! Tasted like candle grease. But when at last he put her down in front of a little mirror, she had to admit she looked rather wonderful. Now listen, said the puppet man. I don't mind if you make up your own speeches, but you must follow the story as I tell it. And one thing you must remember, no advertising. It's strictly forbidden on this TV station. Is it indeed? Said Mrs. Pepperpot, who'd not forgiven him for the rough treatment she'd had. Why, he'd even pulled her hair. We'll see about that, she muttered. But there was no time to argue, as the puppet man was preparing to raise the curtain again. The scene was the same as before, but at first it was empty of puppets, while the puppet man read the introduction to the next part of the story. The king was so anxious to keep his only child safe from all harm that he ordered every spindle in the country to be burned and forbade any more to be made. Meanwhile, the princess grew up with all the gifts she'd received from the fairies. She was good and beautiful, modest and patient, and everyone loved her. Then, one day, when she was 15 years old, the king and queen had gone out, and she was all alone in the palace. She thought she would explore a bit. The puppet man stopped reading and whispered to Mrs. Pepperpot, "This is where you come in. Walk across the marble hall and up the winding staircase in the corner. You'll find the witch at the top spinning." He gave her a little push, and Mrs. Pepperpot, in all her princess finery, walked onto the stage as grandly as she could. In the middle of the marble hall she stood still and looked for the staircase. When she saw it, she turned to the audience, and pointing to the stairs, she said, "I have to go up there. I hope it's safe. Always buy planks at Banks, the lumberman." And up she went, holding her long skirt like a lady. At the top of the stairs she found the witch puppet sitting, turning her spindle in her hand. "Why, whatever are you doing with that old-fashioned thing?" said Mrs. Pepperpot. "I am spinning," said the puppet man in his old witch voice. "I call that silly," said Mrs. Pepperpot, "when you can buy the best knitting wool in town at Lamb's wool shop." The audience laughed at this, but the puppet man was not amused. However, he could not stop now, so he went on with the play, saying in his old witch voice, "Would you like to spin, my child?" "I don't mind if I do," said Mrs. Pepperpot. As she took the spindle from the witch's hand, the puppet man whispered to her to pretend to prick herself. "Ouch!" cried Mrs. Pepperpot, sucking her finger and shaking it. "I need a plaster from Mr. Sands the chemist." Again the audience laughed. The puppet man now whispered to her to lie down on the bed to sleep. She asked if he wanted her to snore to make it more lifelike. "Of course not," he said angrily, "and I don't want any advertising for sleeping pills either." "Not necessary," said Mrs. Pepperpot, making herself comfortable on the bed. Then she raised her head for a moment, and in a sing-song voice she spoke to the people in the audience. "The moment you recline on a mattress from a vine, you will fall into a sleep that is really quite divine." The puppet man had difficulty in getting himself heard through the shouts of laughter that greeted this outrageous poem. But at last he was able to go on with the story, how the princess slept for 100 years, and everyone in the palace slept too. When he got to the bit about the rose hedge growing thicker and thicker around the walls of the palace, Mrs. Pepperpot popped her head up again and said, "Quick-growing roses from rattling in Moses," and then pretended to sleep again. She was really getting her revenge on the puppet man, and she was enjoying every minute of it. The puppet man struggled on, but now the audience laughed at everything that was said, and he began to wonder if he should stop the show. He tried reading again. At length the king's son came to the narrow stairs in the tower. When he reached the top, he opened the door of the little chamber, and there he saw the most beautiful sight he had ever seen, the Sleeping Beauty. While the gramophone played soft music to suit the scene, the puppet prince walked up the stairs and came through the door. Mrs. Pepperpot winked one eye at the audience and said, "I owe my beautiful skin to complexion milk by Flynn." The puppet prince walked stiffly over to her bed and stiffly bent down and planted a wooden kiss on her cheek. But this was too much for Mrs. Pepperpot. "Nope, nope," she shrieked, jumping out of bed and knocking the prince flying, so that all his threads broke and he landed in an untidy heap at the bottom of the stairs. Down the stairs came Mrs. Pepperpot herself, and jumping over the fallen prince, she rushed across the stage and out through the curtain, while the audience rolled in their seats and clapped and shouted for the princess to come back. But once safely in the dressing-room, Mrs. Pepperpot only just had time to snatch off her wig and veil and crown before she grew to her normal size. The little things she put in her handbag, and she walked through the door as calmly as you please, only to be met by the poor puppet man, who was wringing his hands and crying even worse than before the show. "Whatever's the matter?" asked Mrs. Pepperpot. "My show's ruined," he wailed. "They'll never put it on TV again after all that advertising." "Advertising?" Mrs. Pepperpot pretended to be very surprised. "Wasn't it all part of the play?" But the puppet man wasn't listening to her. Oh dear, what will become of me? And now I have no Sleeping Beauty at all." "You should treat your puppets with more respect," said Mrs. Pepperpot. "They don't like being pushed about and having their hair pulled." With that she left him and walked out to the square to get on the bus. Her friends had all been too busy laughing and discussing the play to notice that she hadn't been with them. She sat down next to Sarah South, who asked her if she had enjoyed the show. "Oh, I had a lovely time. We all did, I mean," said Mrs. Pepperpot. A few days later, the puppet man was mending the threads of his puppet prints. He was feeling happier now, because all the newspapers had written that his way of playing Sleeping Beauty was new and original, and they all praised his performance very highly. There was a knock on the door, and the postman handed him a small parcel. He wondered what it could be, but when he opened it, he stared with astonishment. Inside was the princess's wig, crown, and veil, and also a reel of black thread and a little note. The puppet man read it aloud. "As back to you these things I send, may I be bold and recommend. When next your puppet prints you mend, try Jiffy's thread, it will not rend." Who had sent the parcel? And where did that little puppet go who could walk and talk on its own? "Oh, if only I knew," sighed the puppet man.